Do your mornings start with overwhelm and anxiety, trying to figure out enough time to get everything done? Ironically, taking a little time to yourself and setting up a morning routine may alleviate a lot of that stress and anxiety that so many of us feel. We're all busy, whether we're parents, business owners, or anything in between. Having a dialed in schedule in the morning can be a lifesaver. In this episode, we talk about the value of morning routine, finding one that is sustainable and applicable to your situation, and how you may not have to wake up at 4 a.m. to make it all work. This is the No Excuse to Miss podcast. Welcome to the No Excuse to Miss podcast. I'm your host, Scott Volquartsen. This week, I'm here along with our Director of Marketing, Chad Wittrock. A couple quick things before we get started is, as you may have noticed, we've taken a couple weeks off from the podcast, but that doesn't mean we haven't been working behind the scenes to bring a better product for 2023. We're upgrading a few things, adding the option of video. So a lot of exciting things to come with some really cool and interesting guests on the way. This week, though, we're going to dive into something a little bit different. We're getting towards the end of the year. Everybody's looking at New Year's resolutions, new routines, everything. So we're going to kind of dive into that. But before we do, how are you doing today, Chad?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited about this episode. Morning routines are something you and I talk about quite a bit. So I think this is going to be a really valuable one here as people kick off the new year. And I think this will likely be airing right after the first of the year. So this would be perfect timing for people that are looking to change up their morning routine or maybe create a new one from scratch. So
and I'm not one that's really big on New Year's resolutions. I prefer to try to implement things right away, but the reality is I think we all always look at a new year as kind of like a new reset, regardless of how we say we don't have New Year's resolutions or whatever. It's tough to get away from.
I completely agree. I think we talked about that before too. I think even if you're not a fan of New Year's resolutions, and I'm typically the same way, if you're going to implement something, just implement it. Don't wait for an arbitrary date on the calendar. But I think it's hard to get away from the fact that we view it as a reset. So morning routines are super important and obviously sets the stage for your day. So, where should people start? Where should they jump in?
The first thing I want to say is I first started doing them religiously probably 10 plus years ago. But the biggest thing that I have found is, one, they're constantly evolving. So what I did 10 years ago doesn't look like anything like what I do for my morning routine now. The second thing is,
did you have a high school routine or college morning routine?
No, absolutely not.
You were a roll out of bed, get out the door with a Pop-Tart in your mouth kind of guy.
And it quote unquote worked for me back then. But as, business evolved, I got married, I had kids, became had a much larger role in, day-to-day operations, everything. Things were starting to get overwhelming and I was wasting a lot of time. So they started to be implemented by necessity. And at first, when I was first kind of introduced to them, I would take other people's routines and be like, I got to do all this stuff. But as I went, I'm like, that almost became more stressful because at one time, my morning routine was probably 90 minutes. And I'm like, I got to do all this, meditate, read.
I was just going to say, you made a morning routine gumbo out of everybody's advice.
Yes. And it's not sustainable. So over the years, I've kind of adopted into a morning routine that works for me. It allows me, at least in my opinion, to be productive. And the nice thing about it is I can change it and see, okay, did that help? Because I think so many of us, and I know this from experience, if you don't have that morning routine, what ends up happening is we become completely reactive to everything that's going to happen throughout the day. And it's really hard to be proactive in any way. So I think our stress builds, anxiety builds, and we become much less effective in our workday. We may be busy because I think, at least for me, what happened is when I didn't have that morning routine, which I call it a morning routine, it actually starts the night before, where I will write down 3 to 4 of my most important tasks that I need to take care of for the day. And what that saves me from doing is, in the past, I would show up for work not exactly knowing what had to be addressed, what needed to be done. And I think we can all relate to this. So at that point, we dive into email or something maybe not as beneficial, but at least we feel busy.
Well, I think it goes back to your point earlier about being reactive. I think if you just sit down, the first thing that catches your attention is going to get your attention and probably set the stage for the rest of the day from a reactive standpoint.
Yes. And
to your previous point, I guess the takeaway earlier there was crafting a routine that is sustainable to your lifestyle. Because you mentioned, well, your initial morning routine when you started getting into this was like 90 minutes years ago, and that just wasn't sustainable.
No, and what was happening is I was following a morning routine that was kind of presented to me by somebody else. That person didn't have 3 kids.
Yep, and I can relate to that.
So that will, that completely alters things, on how it all looks. And so for me now, what I have found, the other thing that I think the morning routine helps, at least what I've found, is without it, I tend to push the most difficult task or the hardest task off throughout the day versus doing them right away in the morning when my energy's highest.
And focus is high.
I'm controlling the narrative. My focus is high. I can get that done. And then it's almost like a mental boost throughout the rest of the day that regardless of what happens, what chaos takes place, I got those 2 to 3 high level things done for the day.
Sure. And I think one thing you said, a lot of times the key to a successful morning routine is starting the night before. Do you want to expand on that? Because I think that's a great point, starting the night before. So
what I do, and I've learned this from other people that study this a lot more than I do, but I'll write down 2 to 3 things that have to take place that following morning. And that does a couple things for me. One, it allows me to sleep better because I'm not constantly thinking of my to-do list for the next day. I've got it all out on paper. I've written it down. And
you're not trying to take mental notes on it.
Not trying to take mental notes. And what I'll find is a lot of times when I start writing down those 2 to 3 most important tasks for the next day is I also will do a little bit of a brain dump of other things that might be bothering me, other things that came up through the day. I try to unload so that way when I go to bed, my mind is clear. And much to my wife's dismay, she does not sleep very well, I can lay down and within 2 to 3 minutes, I am usually out.
Well, I was just going to say it leads to better quality sleep, I think, too.
Yeah, so I sleep like a rock. And, I know, like you said, we've talked about these morning routines a lot, and it allows me to get up and become more productive and not waste, a couple hours in the morning. Because if I could go back, that'd be one of the biggest things I changed when I was younger is that dialed in routine.
Yeah, I think that's a big deal. So kind of set the stage the night before with that checklist. And then when you get up, what does that look like?
Yeah, I'll just kind of run through that. And it's just recently changed. I used to be a workout in the morning type person.
Mm-hmm. Which is common, I would say. It's
common. I like the mental edge that it gave me. And once again, I got that out of the way. So it kind of gave me a boost. But what I found was, as I was working out, I also was thinking about everything that had to be done that day. So I wasn't 100% focused and present with where I was. So I have now pushed that off in towards the end of the day, and I kind of reward myself now. I get to go do that if I got all this other stuff done. And it's almost become a daily non-negotiable for me. So it's actually scheduled into my calendar every single day. So that way it doesn't fill up and I don't give myself an excuse. I got a meeting here. I got to do this. I'm not going to make it.
Well, I think even the way you phrase that, saying I get to work out, is a huge deal on the mental side of that.
I would agree with you. I think too oftentimes we look at it from, I have to go work out, I have to go to the gym, I have to do this. Whereas if you can flip that and say, I get to do it. And that comes from going through a couple things where I couldn't work out for a period of time. I realized how fortunate many of us are that we get to go do that. We get to take care of ourselves. We get to clear our minds, do all that. So at least that's the way I look at it, and that's what works for me. But I'll kind of get back to the morning routine now of what I do. Is first thing I do when I wake up is I've read from guys like Sean Stevenson and a lot of different people that with how dehydrated we become throughout the night, the first thing we should do is hydrate ourselves with water.
Absolutely.
So for me, it's 20 ounces of water. I take a green supplement, a couple other, small supplements that I just take them then so I don't forget throughout the day. Some krill oil, some vitamin D, just a couple things baseline. And I am a big caffeine guy, maybe a little too much so. So
I can relate.
Once I get my my water drank, the next thing I do, is put the coffee on. But something else that I've recently learned is if I eat something prior to that first cup of coffee, the caffeine, it seems to sustain a little bit longer, a little easier on my stomach. I don't have many digestive issues, but I know a lot of people, coffee on an empty stomach will cause them some duress or digestive stress. So, I put something in my stomach, and I know intermittent fasting's popular for a lot of people. I have found that does not work for me. So I kind of set the stage with, a healthy little, basically a snack, go through, have my coffee. And as I'm drinking my coffee, the big thing that I do now is I will read every morning. And
over coffee.
Over coffee, and it's, it may only be 10 to 15 minutes, but it's pretty sustainable. It allows me to, if it's the right book, it gets your mind in the right place to kind of fire you up for the day.
Well, I think that's a great caveat. I was just talking to my kids about this is because I think we get it in our heads that if you want to be a serious reader, you need to sit down and read for 1 or 2 hours. And I was telling them this thing too. If you can just sit and read for 15, 20, 25 minutes daily, as opposed to going back saying I have to read a couple hours, that's going to be an insanely valuable asset.
Yeah. And you'll see I've read a lot online and heard different places, they'll recommend even just 10 pages a day minimum.
Yeah, that'd be a great goal.
And I think often if we sit down with our goal to read 10 pages, we're not going to stop there. Right. It's going to become 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes. But if you sit down thinking you have to read for an hour, it's hard to find that time.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Kind of like going to the gym. You think you don't have time, you don't think you don't have energy, but if you can just get there and get those first couple, get the blood flowing, get some reps going.
Yep.
Next thing you know, you've been there an hour and it.
Yeah, I was just talking about this. I do a lot of walking, and in all kinds of weather. Typically, I don't miss a good walk during the day. And someone asked me, how do you get through 1 or 2 miles walking in all these different scenarios? And I said, honestly, the hardest part is getting my shoes on and opening the door. Once I get through that door and I take that first step, I'm committed. I have no problem knowing I'm going to finish that walk. But you got to get your shoes on. You got to open the door.
Exactly. That's such a good point too. And the other thing that I didn't mention, and it's tough to do this time of year when we're in Iowa or the Midwest, basically anywhere it's so dark and cold in the morning. But I have found that if you can get outside early and get some sunlight, it helps set that circadian rhythm, which once again goes back to setting the stage for your sleep that following night.
Sure.
That, getting outside, getting that fresh air. And like I said, we're expecting minus 30 plus wind chills in the next couple of days. So more than likely I'm not going to be out there. But when it is possible, that's, another tenet. I love to get outside, so I've, got my coffee, done my reading. If possible, I've been outside. And the other thing that I didn't mention and this one is something that I really struggle with. But a lot of people that focus on productivity and overall happiness will say, try to avoid looking at your phone that first 30 to 60 minutes.
That's one thing I've worked really hard on this year.
Because once again, it's inevitable. You're going to pick up your phone, you're going to see those notifications, and we instantly go into reactive fight or flight mode. And not only that, if it's an email that upsets you, a text that you didn't want to see, you've started your day off on the wrong foot.
Well, it's kind of the flip side of the point you made about reading. We live in an endless scroll world, so a lot of times you think you're going to check your phone, and 20, 25 minutes have passed. You said, not only on top of being reactive to something, if you're doing it for more of a social media dopamine hit, suddenly you're down that rabbit hole.
Exactly. So I still struggle with that, looking at it first thing in the morning, but it is something I'm working on. But, basically once I can get those, those non-negotiables of reading, of, my water, my greens, my supplements, everything, I'm ready to, kind of dive into work and get some of those first 2 to 3 important tasks done.
So how long would you say right now this morning routine would take you, or has taken you kind of up to this point of diving into work?
Typically 45 minutes to an hour.
Sure, that makes sense.
And
that's about perfect, I think.
Yes, and I've learned to just wake up a little bit earlier.
Yep.
But it's back to your point that you mentioned earlier is you'll hear when people hear this or they see other people's morning routines, they'll say, I don't have time. But if you start to audit your time and how much time we spend on social media, with endless scrolling, with engaging in, Facebook arguments, whatever it might be, that we're able to capture that time back.
Well, I think, like you said, adapting a morning routine that works for you is a huge deal. I've adjusted mine. I have younger kids, and getting them ready and off to school is part of my morning that I really enjoy. So my morning routine is actually kind of broke up. I get up and I do typically try and stay off my phone for 30 minutes to an hour, which getting the kids ready for school, that actually isn't too difficult, but that usually ties up about the first half hour of my day. And then once I get them dropped off, I kind of start the other half of my morning routine, which is then very similar to yours. It's, I still try not to check the phone, but it's a light, water, which I'll have probably 16, 20 ounces of water when I wake up. I'll probably have another 16 or so after I get the girls to school. And then similar to you, I'll eat a light breakfast. And then after that, I'll usually start coffee. And then for about 10 minutes, I should read in the morning. I think that's an excellent point. But what I've been doing right now is I'll silence all notifications or completely turn off my phone, and kind of a 10-minute, not necessarily reset, but kind of a 10-minute just, mental prep for the day. And then I'll jump into work. And I think that's been insanely valuable, doing something like that for, a little more of a hectic morning, but still being able to dial it in.
And you bring up a great point with the, 10 minutes. You'll hear a lot of people talk about 5 to 10 minutes of meditation in the morning. And that is something I tried for a long time. But for whatever reason, sitting still for that 5 to 10 minutes almost made me anxious, thinking of, I got to get to all these other things. So what I've done is I've learned to take, and it's not true meditation, but I'll take little times throughout the day where I just kind of turn everything off. It may only be 1 to 2 minutes, but I'll just kind of focus on my breathing, reset my mind, and go that way.
That's an excellent point, because I had the same struggles with meditation. And they say if you're a little more anxious, that meditation isn't always the answer, especially if it's not a guided meditation. And there's a whole tangent to that we could go down. But I think that's an excellent point, and goes back to your original point of being adaptable with your mornings.
Yes. And I've heard so many good things about being able to do it. And, it's one of those things that I constantly got to work for. But then back to one of my original points is you have to find stuff that works and is sustainable.
Yeah, if you're dreading it, you're not going to do it.
No, because what I would find is if I was set to, let's say, meditate, read, and do those things, if I missed the meditating part because that wasn't something I truly enjoyed, at that point, it would throw my whole morning routine out of whack. And now I'm not going to read. Now I'm not going to do this part.
Yep.
Where
it's just domino effects.
And the other side from a mental aspect is when you can commit to your morning routine and you can do those non-negotiables, it subconsciously builds confidence in yourself that you're going to keep those commitments you made to yourself. And there's no better way to start the day than I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. Let's hit those most difficult tasks of the day. And like I said, because, we're all going to encounter chaos as the day goes on. So if we have those difficult things done when we're fresh, when we have our most energy, regardless of what happens the rest of the day, we've had a successful day.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it.
And it helps avoid procrastination, which I am excellent at.
Yeah, you get the important stuff done. The boxes are checked.
Because once again, it's easy. You can hop into your email inbox. You can scroll through social media and, especially in your role in marketing, you can say the social media is work. But we can go through that endless loop. So yes, we're technically busy, but really all we're doing is procrastinating the hard work that needs to be done for the day.
Yeah. Are you working or are you busy? That's a great point. And I think, so if someone is listening and they're like, well, Scott, that sounds great, but I'm just overwhelmed. My days are overwhelming. My mornings are overwhelming. Where should they start? Is there a place that you would start? Would you carve out 10 minutes? Would you carve out 30 and do one or two things? How would you do it?
I was just talking to some guys that I really look up to and have helped kind of mentor me and coach me through this. And one of the biggest things they said is start very simple. Too many times we overcomplicate it all. So if right now you have zero morning routine and you're looking at it, you're like, I don't have 45 minutes or half hour, whatever that time frame is, just take one simple task, even if it's nothing more than I'm going to drink that 20 ounces of water every morning to start my day. Or, pick one or two things. Let me back up. Pick one thing that you think would change the way your morning starts. And one of the easiest ones is stay off your phone for the first 15 to 30 minutes after you wake up. That requires no time.
Yep, I think that's huge.
That's just a commitment to not commit. It's habitual for us to pick our phones up as soon as we wake up to see what we missed. But you can't say you don't have time not to check your phone.
Exactly. Get an alarm clock if you have to.
Yes. And like I said, it's constantly evolving, and I'm sure you can relate to this. Yours evolves as your kids get older. It's a constant evolution of what works and doesn't work. But I'll also say this is I go through phases where I think I have it all figured out in my mornings, and then I'll start to slip on my morning routines. And then let's say 30, 60 days later, everything kind of seems to be a little more chaotic than normal, a little more stressful. And I'll look back and I'll be like, okay, what has changed? And more often than not, it's something in my morning has changed or I wasn't committed to doing it that sets the stage for everything else.
That's a great point. So you're saying that consistency is really what ties into that being proactive versus reactive, and the reactive is what leads to that more of a chaotic interpretation or chaotic mindset. Yes.
Yeah. It's kind of the whole thing. If we can control that first hour of the day versus it controlling us, I don't see how you don't end up having a better day.
That's true. So you essentially went from having no morning routine, high school, college, and then it's kind of evolved since then. Do you think Do you think kids, high school kids, college kids, this is something that they should really look at too? Don't wait to get into the working world. I think it would be easily applicable to students as well.
I think so too. And, and I know it's a little bit tougher when you're younger to even see the value of it. But anytime I think that you can kind of set the stage and control things, because kids right now, and especially the last couple years, have been through more than most, more anxiety. There's more stuff going on. And they're probably as guilty. Not guilty. They're probably as vulnerable as anybody to picking up their phone in that first 5 to 10 minutes and having it ruin their day.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
And I think I was going to say, the biggest thing that for like the young kids is if you can start knocking out those most difficult things first. We've all been, at least I assume we've all been there. We get that project assigned in school, put it off. And next thing you know, the night before, it's due. Stress is at an all-time high, and you turn in a crappy project. And I did that more than most, if I ever even turned the project in to start with. But as I've learned, the other thing that we do, I think, along those same lines is we will sit there and figure out, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this. And that can be draining. Where Absolutely. If we just start knocking those things off, all of a sudden you realize what I thought was going to take 6 hours actually only took 45 minutes once I committed to doing it.
Yeah, it's the whole action over anxiety.
Yes, and that's the lesson that I think kids can take away.
Yeah, I would agree. And granted, when I was in school, we didn't have the cell phone situation that we have now. I was always big on, me and my brother were actually very opposite on this. He was one that could roll out of bed and roll out the door and go. I typically, and still this day, even if I'm traveling or my kids aren't around or don't have school that day or whatnot, I still typically need a good 40 minutes to an hour of kind of neutral time. Even when I was a teenager, that was just how I had to operate to kind of curb anxiety and set the day up.
So you bring up a good point. I know anxiety is something that if you don't control your morning routine or even your daily schedule, anxiety is something that you've dealt with in the past and continue to deal with?
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you get out of that routine, whether you're traveling or whatever it is, do you see that creep back in?
Yeah, I think it can creep in real easily. I think, so what I do, and back to your point of one or two things, I know that if I can be proactive with when I get up in relation to when I have to start a commitment or an obligation, having that 30 to 45 minutes is probably crucial. Even if it's just that, even if taking breakfast out of it, taking coffee out of it, taking, if it's 30 to 40 minutes of just kind of mental prep time, that can change or set up the whole day versus if you get into that mode of scrambling, then I think you're stuck in that gear. It's real hard to shift back down.
And you bring up an excellent point of getting up. That's the other thing I do is typically, if at all possible, I get up and go to bed the same time every single day.
I do the same thing.
And back to your point of what's something people can do. If you currently wake up, whatever time, let's say 6:30, don't instantly all of a sudden try to be up at 4:30 or 5. From the science I've read behind this is it's much easier. Just move your alarm up 10 or 15 minutes.
That's a great point.
And you'll always hear Bedros Keuilian talk about this, he's got some phenomenal stuff out there on morning routines, but he'll always talk about do not hit your snooze button. As he says, once you hit your snooze button, you're basically hitting snooze on your hopes and dreams for the day.
Yep, I think that's a great reminder, great way to put it.
And I've learned, I mean, we all want to do it, but the one big thing I've learned is waking up, hitting snooze for 10 or 15 minutes and waking up and then all of a sudden having to rush through everything to get my day started is never worth that extra 10 to 15 minutes of sleep.
Yep, that rush.
And if my wife listens to this, she will argue that point to her death.
Mine would too. But no, I think you're spot on. I think
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, I think it goes back to crafting a routine that works for you. Years and years ago, this has probably been over 6 years, and I started looking into some of this again. Probably over 6 years ago, I tried to be that person because at the time that was the big thing. If you wanted to be successful, the successful people were up at 4:30. And I tried that, and I just quickly knew it wasn't sustainable. I'm a night owl. I always have been, and I'm not the night owl I used to be, but I typically go to bed later, typically between 10 and 11 p.m. So that's the early rise. A 4 a.m. rise for me is just it's okay for me to admit that that's not how I'm wired.
100%. You have to keep it sustainable. Otherwise, it's doing the opposite. It's becoming another stressor.
Yep, exactly. And most people probably wouldn't consider 10 or 11 p.m. a night owl.
You just realize you're talking to me and you realize that's way past my bedtime.
Exactly. When I was doing work years ago, I was very much one of the 2 or 3 a.m. That was when I would do the most creative work, would be typically from 10 to 2 a.m. And I got older and I have no desire to really stay up till 2 a.m. anymore. I like my mornings. Like you said, my routine's evolved. I enjoy mornings. It's just not the 4 a.m. mornings that most of the other gurus like to talk about.
And to your point of keeping it sustainable is, we have to. Mike DeSanti just talked to me about this. Is keep it simple. We want to overcomplicate everything. We want to compare how do our morning routines look to other people, and maybe not. You're not comparing morning routines, but we compare everything to how it looks or compares to what we're seeing with other people. Find out what works for you, and then be willing to admit that what you thought was working is not working, and change. And that's what I did. Like I talked earlier, that's what I did with my workout. I thought that's what I wanted, was to work out early in the morning, even though I knew from a physical standpoint, it's better to get up a couple hours, and from an overall health and injury standpoint. So be willing to change, be willing to, evolve, but to your point, keep it sustainable and keep it simple.
Yeah, I think that's perfect advice, and I think that's a great way to wrap up. Unless there's anything else you want to add on the importance of morning routine.
No, that kind of covers it. And there's so many people out there that have so much good information on that. So that's the other thing I would recommend is if you're looking for somebody to follow, do whatever in that regard, find somebody that resonates with what you have going on, and just take bits and pieces and start applying it into your own life. And I think if you can start to do that, you'll see some drastic improvements for 2023.
Completely agree. Implement small changes, get big results.
I agree. And as always, thank you everybody for listening. If you ever have any questions or suggestions, hit us up at podcast@volquartsen.com. Happy New Year.